The house looked wrong from a quarter-mile out. Caleb Morgan pulled his horse to a stop on the ridge overlooking his property, squinting against the late afternoon sun that turned the Montana grasslands into a sea of burnt gold. 3 weeks he'd been gone, driving cattle through terrain that could break a man's spirit and body in equal measure. 3 weeks of sleeping on frozen ground, eating beans from a can, and pushing stubborn livestock through mountain passes that didn't want them there. He'd lost 2 steers to a ravine and nearly lost himself to exhaustion, but the money would see him through winter. That's all that mattered, the money and getting back to the silence. Except his house wasn't silent. Smoke curled from the chimney in a thin gray line against the darkening sky. Caleb's jaw tightened. His right hand moved instinctively to the rifle strapped to his saddle. Nobody had permission to be here. Nobody even had a key except old Thomas Greer, who ran the general store in town, and who'd rather eat his own boot leather than venture 8 miles into the wilderness to check on a house that didn't need checking. He urged his horse forward, keeping low, watching the windows. The curtains he never bothered to close because who the hell was out here to look in, were drawn. Light flickered behind them, lamplight. Someone was making themselves comfortable. His mind ran through possibilities. Drifters looking for shelter wouldn't announce themselves with a fire. Thieves wouldn't stick around this close to sunset. The Blackfoot hadn't come this far south in years, and even if they had, they wouldn't waste time on a house when there was livestock to take. That left something worse, someone who thought they had a right to be there. Caleb dismounted 100 yards from the house, tying his horse to the split-rail fence he'd built 2 summers ago when he still believed hard work could fill the emptiness. He checked his rifle, loaded, as always, and approached on foot, boots crunching on the frost-hardened dirt. November in Montana Territory meant winter was breathing down your neck, and the cold had teeth. The front door wasn't forced, no splintered wood, no broken lock. It stood slightly ajar, warm light spilling out onto the porch he'd never finished building. From inside came a sound that stopped him cold. Humming. A woman's voice, low and melodic, carrying a tune he didn't recognize. Caleb's finger found the trigger. He shouldered the door open hard, rifle raised, ready for... She didn't scream. The woman at his stove, turned her head calmly, as if she'd been expecting company. She held a wooden spoon in one hand and a pot lid in the other. Steam rose from whatever she was cooking, filling the single-room cabin with the smell of beef stew and fresh bread. His table, the rough-hewn table he ate at alone every goddamn night, was set for 2. Plates, forks, even a napkin folded beside each setting like this was some Boston dining room instead of a bachelor's hovel at the edge of nowhere. "You can lower the rifle, Mr. Morgan," she said. Her voice was steady, not frightened, not apologetic, just matter of fact. "I'm not armed, and I'm certainly not here to rob you. Your cupboards are depressingly bare, by the way. When's the last time you bought flour that wasn't half weevils?" Caleb didn't lower the rifle. "Who the hell are you?" "Lydia Harper." She turned back to the stove, stirring the pot as if having a gun pointed at her back was a minor inconvenience. "I teach at the schoolhouse in town. You wouldn't know me. You don't come to town except for supplies, and even then, you're in and out like the place might catch fire if you stay too long." "That doesn't explain what you're doing in my house." "Cooking dinner." She tasted the stew from the spoon, considered it, then added a pinch of salt from a small cloth bag she'd apparently brought with her. "You've been gone 3 weeks. I heard you were due back today. Figured you'd be hungry." The absolute audacity of it left him speechless for a moment. He lowered the rifle, not because he trusted her, but because shooting an unarmed woman for the crime of making stew seemed excessive even by frontier standards. "You figured? Lady, you broke into my house. I didn't break anything." She gestured to the table without looking at him. "Thomas Greer lent me his key. He was worried about you, said you took fewer supplies than usual, which meant you'd come back hungry or not come back at all. Since you're standing here pointing guns at people, I'm guessing it's the former." Caleb set the rifle against the wall, but kept it within reach. He studied her in the lamplight. She was probably 30, maybe a year or 2 older, hard to tell with women who'd spent time on the frontier. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, showing a face that wasn't pretty in the soft Eastern way, but had the kind of strong bones that would age well. She wore a simple gray dress with a white apron over it, both showing signs of wear but clean. A schoolteacher's salary didn't buy much, even in a town desperate enough to hire women for the job. Thomas Greer had no right to give you that key. Thomas Greer is 73 years old and can barely walk to his own privy without help. He wasn't going to check on you himself. She ladled stew into 2 bowls with efficient movements. Sit down before this gets cold. I didn't haul supplies 8 miles on a borrowed horse just to watch you stand there looking suspicious. I am suspicious. I don't know you. That's why we're having dinner. She set both bowls on the table, then retrieved the bread, actual bread, not the hardtack he'd been surviving on, from a cloth-covered basket. Sit, Mr. Morgan. I promise the stew isn't poisoned. I ate some while you were doing your best impression of a hostile grizzly bear. Against every instinct that had kept him alive for 42 years, Caleb pulled out a chair and sat. Partly because the stew smelled better than anything he'd eaten in months. Partly because this woman had somehow turned his own house into foreign territory, and he needed to figure out how. Lydia took the seat across from him, folded her hands, and looked at him expectantly. "What?" he said. "Aren't you going to eat?" "I'm still deciding if you're crazy or just stupid." A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Not a polite smile, but something genuine and slightly amused. "I've been called both, usually by men who can't handle a woman showing up uninvited. Most women don't show up uninvited to a stranger's house in the middle of nowhere. Most women aren't me." She picked up her spoon. "And technically, this isn't the middle of nowhere. It's 8 miles from town. I've lived in actual nowhere, Mr. Morgan. This is just remote." He took a bite of stew. Damn it, it was good. Better than good. The beef was tender, the vegetables cooked just right, and there was something in the seasoning he couldn't place. Thyme maybe, or something else he'd never bothered to learn the name of. He tried not to let his face show how much he'd needed this. A real meal after weeks of trail food and cold camps. "Where's actual nowhere?" he asked, because it seemed safer than admitting she'd been right about him being hungry. "Nebraska. My late husband's homestead claim 3 years ago. 60 miles from the nearest trading post. We lasted 8 months before the winter killed him and nearly killed me." She said it without drama, just fact. This part of Montana feels downright civilized by comparison. At least you have neighbors within shouting distance if you really needed them. "I don't." "Need them or have them?" "Both." She nodded as if she'd expected that answer. "Thomas said you were like that. Been here 6 years, barely speaks to anyone, works himself half to death every season. I thought he was exaggerating, but then I saw your pantry. A man who keeps a house like that isn't planning for company." Caleb set down his spoon harder than necessary. "Why are you really here, Mrs. Harper?" "Lydia." "I didn't ask for your first name." "You're going to use it anyway, because calling me Mrs. Harper makes me sound like my mother-in-law, and she's dead, thank Christ." She tore off a piece of bread, soaked it in stew. "And I'm here because Thomas said you were a decent man who helped him fix his store roof last spring without asking for payment. He said you didn't talk much, but you worked hard and you didn't cheat him. In a place like this, that counts for something. So when I heard you were coming back alone after 3 weeks in the mountains, I thought—" She trailed off. For the first time since he'd walked in, she looked uncertain. "You thought what?" Caleb pressed. "I thought nobody should come home to an empty house and a cold stove after that long on the trail. I've done it. It's miserable." She met his eyes, and he saw something there he recognized. Not pity, but understanding. The kind you only get from experience. "I wasn't trying to intrude on your life, Mr. Morgan. I was just trying to make it a little less hard for one night." The fire crackled. Outside, his horse nickered softly. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon. All the familiar sounds of his solitary existence, except now there was another person sitting across from him, uninvited and inexplicable, and somehow not entirely unwelcome. "You're still crazy," he said finally. "Probably." She smiled again, that real smile that showed teeth and crinkled the corners of her eyes. "But at least you're eating." They ate in silence for a while. Not the uncomfortable silence of strangers, but something easier. Caleb hadn't realized how much noise another person made in a room. The small sounds of breathing, of silverware on plate, of someone alive and present. It filled spaces he'd forgotten were empty. "How'd you get here?" he asked eventually. "You said you borrowed a horse." "From the Pritchards. They owe me for tutoring their daughter in reading. I told them I'd bring the horse back before dark."
She glanced at the window where full darkness had fallen, which I'm now not going to make, but they'll understand, probably. You came out here alone? In the dark?
It'll be dark going back too. She said it like it was nothing, but Caleb knew what 8 miles meant at night. Even on the trail, with a good moon, you could get turned around, hit a prairie dog hole wrong, and your horse goes down. Or worse, you run into something that thinks you're dinner. You're staying until morning, he said. It wasn't a question. Her eyebrows rose. That would be highly inappropriate, Mr. Morgan. So is breaking into a man's house and cooking him dinner, but you already did that. At least this way you won't break your neck riding back in the dark. He pushed his empty bowl away. You can have the bed. I'll sleep on the floor. I've been sleeping on the ground for 3 weeks anyway. A blanket and some floorboards will feel like a luxury. She studied him for a long moment, weighing something he couldn't read. You're serious? I may not like surprises, Mrs. Harper, but I'm not going to send you out there to die for the sake of propriety. Town can gossip all it wants. They will. Let them. She laughed, a short, surprised sound. You really don't care what people think, do you? Never saw the point. People think what they want regardless of what you do. Might as well do the right thing and ignore them. That's either very wise or very lonely. Can it be both? She considered that, then nodded slowly. Yes, I suppose it can. They cleaned up together, which felt stranger than sharing a meal. Caleb washed while Lydia dried, their hands occasionally colliding in the small space near the basin. She didn't flinch away, and neither did he. It felt normal, domestic, like something from a life he'd given up on a long time ago. You don't have to do this, he said as she stacked the plates in his cupboard, the same cupboard she'd criticized earlier for its lack of decent flour. Do what? Any of it. The cooking, the staying, the making my house feel less like a tomb. I didn't ask for it. I know. She dried her hands on the apron, then untied it and folded it carefully. But sometimes the things we don't ask for are the things we need most. He didn't have an answer for that. Lydia turned toward him, and in the dim lamplight he saw something in her face that mirrored what he felt but never spoke about. The weight of waking up alone, of eating alone, of working until your body gave out because it was easier than sitting with your thoughts. She'd lost a husband. He'd lost, well, everything else. I'll be gone by first light, she said quietly. This was just a meal, Mr. Morgan. I'm not asking for anything more. Caleb, he said. What? If you're going to call me by my first name anyway, might as well start now. She smiled, a smaller, softer version of the earlier one. Caleb, then. You do this for everyone? Show up uninvited and cook them dinner? No, just you. Why? She moved toward the door where she'd left a shawl draped over a hook. Because Thomas said you were worth checking on, and because I know what it's like to be too tired to care if you live or die. Someone checked on me once, in Nebraska, right before I gave up completely. A traveling minister who had no reason to stop but did anyway. He didn't save me with prayer or scripture. He just brought me firewood and told me I was allowed to survive. She wrapped the shawl around her shoulders. I've been trying to pass that forward ever since. Caleb felt something crack open in his chest, something he'd kept sealed tight for years. I'm not giving up. I didn't think you were. But there's a difference between surviving and living, and I figured you'd forgotten the difference. She gestured to the table, the clean dishes, the lingering warmth of the meal. This is the difference. Before he could respond, she'd crossed the room and placed her hand briefly on his arm, a touch so quick and light he almost thought he'd imagined it. Then she was settling into the wooden chair near the fire, tucking her skirts around her legs with practiced efficiency. You don't have to sleep on the floor, she said. The bed's big enough for 2 if we're sensible about it. We're both adults. I think we can manage one night without scandal. Caleb shook his head. Floor's fine. Like I said, luxury compared to the trail. He spread out his bedroll near the door, far enough from the fire to give her privacy, but close enough to the rifle that he could reach it if needed. Old habits. The war had taught him to sleep light and wake ready, and the frontier had reinforced those lessons until they were bone deep. Lydia settled into the bed, his bed, which suddenly looked different with someone in it, and pulled the quilt up to her shoulders. Thank you, she said into the darkness, for not shooting me. Night's not over yet, she laughed quietly. Fair point. The fire burned down to embers. His horse shuffled outside. Somewhere in the vast Montana darkness, life continued its ancient patterns. Predator and prey, hunter and hunted, the strong and the barely surviving. Inside this small cabin, two people who'd been alone too long lay awake in the same room, not touching, not speaking, but somehow less alone than they'd been in a long time. Caleb stared at the ceiling beams he'd installed himself, thinking about the woman who'd invaded his space and somehow made it feel less like a prison. He'd come home expecting silence and solitude. Instead, he'd found smoke in the chimney, food on the table, and a stranger who'd looked at his empty life and decided it needed filling. He should have been angry. He should have sent her away. But lying there in the dark, listening to her breathing settle into sleep, he couldn't bring himself to regret that he hadn't. "Lydia?" he said softly, not sure if she was still awake. "Yes? Why'd you really come here? The truth." A long pause. Then, "Because I'm tired of being alone, and I thought maybe you were too." Caleb closed his eyes. "Yeah," he whispered. "I am." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and whistling through the gaps in the walls he kept meaning to fix. But inside, the cabin held its warmth, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Caleb Morgan fell asleep knowing that when he woke up, he wouldn't be alone. He didn't know yet that this single night would crack open his carefully constructed solitude. He didn't know that Lydia Harper would become a regular presence in his life, showing up once a week with food and conversation that slowly wore down his defenses. He didn't know that her brother-in-law would come hunting for her with lawyers and inheritance clauses designed to control her future. He didn't know that a storm would trap them together and force them to confront what was building between them. All he knew was that a stranger had walked into his house and made him remember what it felt like to come home to something other than silence. And for now, in the warmth of the fire and the quiet of the night, that was enough. Morning came too early and too bright. Caleb woke to the smell of coffee. Real coffee, not the burnt chicory substitute he'd been rationing, and the sound of someone moving around his kitchen with the confidence of long practice. For a disoriented moment, he thought he was still dreaming, or maybe back in the war when camp cooks started fires before dawn. Then memory crashed back. Lydia Harper, the uninvited schoolteacher who'd turned his house into something resembling a home for one night. He sat up, his back protesting the wooden floor despite his claims about luxury. Through the window, pale gray light suggested sunrise was still an hour off. Lydia was already dressed, her hair pinned up, working at the stove with the same calm efficiency she'd shown the night before. "You're up early," he said, his voice rough from sleep. She glanced over her shoulder. "Habit. School starts at 8, and I need to return the Pritchard's horse before then. I made coffee. It's strong. I assume you're not the type who likes it weak." "You assume right." He stood, rolling his shoulders, and caught her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "What?" "Nothing. Just thinking you look exactly like a man who spent 3 weeks sleeping on rocks." She poured 2 cups of coffee, handed him one. "There's bread left from last night if you want it." They stood on opposite sides of the small room, drinking coffee in the pre-dawn quiet. Caleb found himself noticing details he'd missed the night before. The way she favored her left leg slightly when she walked, the small scar on her right hand, the deliberate way she kept space between them as if she'd calculated exactly how close was acceptable and refused to cross that line. "You do this every morning?" he asked. "Wake up before the sun?" "Have since Nebraska. My husband needed help with the animals before dawn, and after he died, I couldn't break the habit. Now I use the time to prepare lessons." She set down her cup. "I should go. Thank you for not making this more awkward than it needed to be." "Still awkward?" "Yes, but tolerably so." She gathered her shawl, the empty basket she'd brought the food in, and moved toward the door. Then she paused, her hand on the latch. "May I ask you something? Seems like you're going to regardless. Do you ever come to town for anything other than supplies?" Caleb frowned. "Why would I?" "Community, conversation, the basic human need to exist around other people occasionally. I exist just fine out here." "Existing isn't living." She said it gently, without judgment, but it still hit like an accusation. "There's a dance next Saturday at the church hall. Nothing fancy, just fiddles and conversation and people pretending they know how to dance. You should come." "I don't dance." Neither do most of the men. They still show up because it's better than sitting alone in the dark. She opened the door, letting in a gust of cold air. Think about it. And if you decide you're tired of your own company, you know where to find me. She was gone before he could argue, riding off into the pale dawn on a horse that looked as tired as he felt. Caleb stood in the doorway, coffee cooling in his hand, watching until she disappeared over the ridge. The house felt wrong again, too quiet, too empty, too much like it had been for the past 6 years. He spent the day trying to forget about her. He tended to his horse, repaired a section of fence the winter weather had damaged, checked his small herd of cattle grazing in the south pasture. Normal work, the kind that filled hours without filling the spaces inside your head. But every time he came back to the house, he noticed things that hadn't bothered him before. The plate she'd eaten from, now washed and put away. The chair where she'd sat, now empty. The bed that still smelled faintly of lavender soap. Saturday came and went. He didn't go to the dance, couldn't bring himself to ride into town and stand around making small talk with people who'd forget his name before he left. Instead, he worked until exhaustion made him stupid, then fell into bed and tried not to think about a schoolteacher who'd looked at his life and called it existing instead of living. The following Tuesday, she came back. Caleb was splitting wood behind the house when he heard hoofbeats. He turned, axe in hand, and there she was, riding up on the same borrowed horse, another basket strapped to the saddle. This time she didn't look uncertain. She looked determined. "Before you start threatening me with that axe," she called out as she dismounted, "I brought pot roast and potatoes, also an apology for ambushing you last time." "You're ambushing me again." "Yes, but this time I'm being honest about it." She untied the basket, held it up like evidence. "I figured we could make this a regular thing. Once a week, I bring dinner, we eat like civilized people, and then I leave. No expectations, no obligations, just food and conversation with someone who isn't a 7-year-old asking why clouds float." Caleb set down the axe. "Why?" "Because I like talking to someone who doesn't need me to explain every word over 3 syllables. Because you didn't treat me like I was crazy for showing up uninvited. Because—" She stopped, seeming to weigh her words. "Because I'm tired of eating alone, and I suspect you are too, even if you won't admit it." He should have said no. Should have told her he didn't need charity or company or whatever this was she was offering. Instead, he heard himself say, "I can't pay you." "I'm not asking you to. Consider it a fair trade. I get adult conversation, you get edible food. Your cooking skills, based on the state of your pantry, are criminally bad." Despite himself, Caleb almost smiled. "That obvious?" "You had beans from 1875 in there. It's 1881. Those beans are older than most of my students." This time he did smile just a little. "Guess I don't pay much attention to dates." Clearly, she walked past him toward the house, comfortable now in a way she hadn't been that first night. "Are you going to stand out here all day, or are we having dinner?" They fell into a pattern after that. Every Tuesday, like clockwork, Lydia would ride out with food and stay for a few hours. She'd cook while he cleaned up from whatever work he'd been doing, then they'd sit at his table and talk about everything and nothing. She told him about her students, the bright ones who soaked up knowledge like dry earth soaked up rain, and the stubborn ones who fought her on every lesson. He told her about the ranch, the cattle, the constant battle against weather and isolation, and his own tendency to let things slide. What he didn't tell her at first was about the war, about the things he'd seen that made silence easier than conversation, about why he'd come to Montana in the first place, running from memories that followed him anyway. But Lydia had a way of pulling information out without seeming to pry. She'd mentioned something casual, her late husband's habit of whistling off-key, or the way Nebraska winters made Montana feel mild. And Caleb would find himself responding with pieces of his own history, small pieces, nothing that hurt too much to say out loud. "You were a soldier," she said one evening in late November. Not a question. They were washing dishes together, another ritual that had developed without either of them deciding it should. Caleb's hands stilled in the soapy water. "What makes you say that?" "The way you sleep. Even when you think you're relaxed, you're not. You wake up at every small sound, and sometimes when I arrive, I catch you positioning yourself so you can see both the door and the window at the same time." She dried a plate with careful attention. "My husband was the same way. He'd been in the war too. Different side than you, probably, based on your accent, but it marked him the same. Which side was he on? Confederate Virginia Regiment. He never talked about it much, except when the nightmares came. She set down the plate, met his eyes. I'm not asking you to talk about it, just acknowledging that I know it's there. Caleb let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Union. Fought through Tennessee and Georgia. Saw Sherman burn his way to the sea and thought I'd never want to see another fire as long as I lived. He pulled his hands from the water, dried them on a rag. Came out here to get away from people. Figured the fewer folks around, the fewer chances I'd have to remember what people do to each other when they're scared and angry and convinced they're right. Did it work? For a while. Then you showed up and reminded me that isolation has its own cost. She smiled sadly. I'm sorry. Don't be. He surprised himself with the honesty. I think I needed reminding. December brought snow and shorter days. Lydia's Tuesday visits became the bright spot in Caleb's week. Something to look forward to, something that broke up the monotony of survival. He found himself preparing for her arrival in ways he didn't quite acknowledge. He'd make sure the house was cleaner than usual. He'd bathe in the creek even though the water was ice cold. He'd shave, or at least trim his beard so he looked less like a wild man and more like someone who remembered civilization. She noticed, of course. Lydia noticed everything. You fixed the porch step, she said one Tuesday, stamping snow off her boots. It was broken. It's been broken since I started coming here. You fixed it this week. Caleb felt heat crawl up his neck. Seemed like a safety hazard. Mm-hmm. Her eyes sparkled with something between amusement and satisfaction. Well, I appreciate not risking my ankle every time I visit. They'd moved past simple meals into longer evenings. After dinner, they'd sit by the fire and talk until the cold drove Lydia back to town before full darkness fell. She told him about her childhood in Boston, the daughter of a merchant who'd lost everything in a bad investment and drunk himself to death while her mother took in sewing to keep them fed. She'd married young to escape the poverty, a marriage arranged by relatives who'd wanted her off their hands. Her husband had been a decent man, she said, but not a happy one. The war had taken something essential from him, and he'd spent their brief marriage trying to find it again in whiskey and desperate schemes that never worked. The homestead was supposed to be our fresh start, she said, staring into the fire. But he died 3 months in, and I was left with 60 acres of nothing and debts I couldn't pay. I sold everything, came to Montana because I heard they needed teachers and didn't ask too many questions about a woman's past. Started over with what I could carry in one trunk. That's courage, Caleb said. That's desperation. There's a difference. Sometimes they look the same from the outside. She turned to look at him, firelight casting shadows across her face. Is that what brought you here? Courage? Or desperation? Both, probably. Couldn't stay in Ohio after the war. Too many ghosts. Too many people who knew who I used to be. He poked at the fire with an iron rod. Montana was far enough that nobody knew me and nobody cared. Could just be Caleb Morgan, rancher. Not Caleb Morgan who'd killed men and watched friends die and came back wrong. You don't seem wrong to me. You didn't know me before. Maybe I prefer who you are now. She said it quietly, almost to herself, but he heard it anyway. Something shifted between them after that conversation. Nothing dramatic, just a subtle change in the air, like weather turning. Caleb caught himself watching her more closely, noticing the way lamplight caught in her hair, the small smiles she got when something pleased her, the competent movements of her hands as she worked. He'd think about her between visits, wonder what she was doing, if she was warm enough in that drafty schoolhouse, if she thought about him the way he was starting to think about her. It scared him, that growing attachment. Scared him enough that one Tuesday in late December, he almost didn't answer the door when she knocked. She knew something was wrong immediately. What happened? She set down her basket, searched his face with concern. Are you hurt? No? Then why do you look like someone died? Caleb ran a hand through his hair, frustrated with himself. Maybe you shouldn't come here anymore. Lydia went very still. Why not? Because people are going to talk. Hell, they're probably already talking. A single woman riding out to a bachelor's ranch every week? What do you think they're saying about that? I don't care what they're saying. Well, I do. I care about your reputation. You're a teacher. You need the town's respect, or they'll find a reason to fire you. And if they think there's something improper happening between us, is there? She stepped closer, her eyes locked on his. Something improper? He couldn't answer, The truth was complicated and terrifying, and not something he was ready to speak out loud. Because yes, there was something between them now, something that went beyond friendship, beyond simple companionship, something that made his chest tight and his thoughts confused, and his carefully constructed isolation feel like a mistake instead of a solution.
Caleb, she said softly, I'm not some fragile flower who needs protecting from gossip. I've survived worse than small-town rumors. And if you're asking me to stop coming here because you're worried about my reputation, then I appreciate the concern, but I'm declining the protection. What if it's more than gossip? What if they fire you? Then I'll find another job. There are other towns, other schools, but there's only one place where I feel less alone. And I'm not giving that up because narrow-minded people can't imagine a man and woman being friends without scandal. Is that what we are? Friends? The question hung between them like smoke. Lydia held his gaze, unflinching. I don't know, she admitted, but I know I look forward to Tuesdays more than anything else in my week. I know I sleep better on Tuesday nights because I've had real conversation with someone who doesn't bore me or patronize me or treat me like I'm damaged goods because I'm a widow. I know that when I'm here, I feel like myself in a way I haven't felt since before Nebraska. So call it friendship or call it something else, but don't ask me to give it up because you're scared. I'm not scared. You're terrified. I can see it in your face. She reached out, almost touched his arm, then seemed to think better of it. What frightens you more? What people might say, or what this actually is? Caleb turned away, unable to face the truth in her words. Both.
At least you're honest. She picked up her basket, and for a terrible moment, he thought she was leaving. Instead, she started unpacking food with brisk, determined movements. Well, I'm staying for dinner. You can be frightened if you want, but you're not getting rid of me that easily. Despite everything, he laughed, a short, surprised sound. You're stubborn. I prefer persistent. Now set the table before this stew gets cold, and stop trying to noble sacrifice your way out of the only good thing in your life. They ate in silence that night, but it wasn't the comfortable quiet they'd developed over the past months. This was weighted, full of things neither of them knew how to say. When Lydia finally left, wrapping herself against the bitter cold, Caleb stood in the doorway and watched her go with the sick feeling that he'd ruined something precious by acknowledging it existed. But the next Tuesday, she came back. And the Tuesday after that. January turned to February, and still she came, reliable as the sunrise, bringing food and conversation and a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in his hearth. They didn't talk about the tension between them. They talked around it instead, careful conversations that avoided anything too personal, too revealing. Until the day Thomas Greer died. Caleb heard about it when he went into town for supplies. The old storekeeper had passed in his sleep, peacefully, they said, which was the best you could hope for at 73. The funeral would be Saturday. The whole town would attend. He thought about not going. Funerals reminded him too much of the war, of burying boys who'd never get the chance to be men. But Thomas had been decent to him, and more than that, Thomas had given Lydia the key that started everything. He owed the old man at least the courtesy of showing up. The church was packed. Caleb stood in the back, uncomfortable in the only decent shirt he owned, trying not to draw attention. He spotted Lydia near the front, sitting with a group of women he didn't recognize. She wore black, proper mourning clothes that made her look smaller, more fragile than he knew she was. After the service, people gathered outside to talk in the cold sunshine. Caleb was preparing to slip away when he heard a voice behind him. You must be Morgan. He turned to find a man in an expensive suit studying him with barely concealed contempt. The man was maybe 40, with the kind of groomed appearance that screamed money and city life. His boots were polished, his coat perfectly tailored, and his eyes held the calculating look of someone used to getting what he wanted. That's right, Caleb said carefully. And you are? Victor Harper, Lydia's brother-in-law. The man didn't offer his hand. I've heard interesting things about you. That's so? Small towns talk. Apparently my late brother's widow has been visiting your ranch. Alone. Repeatedly. Victor's voice was pleasant, but the words carried an edge. I'm sure you understand my concern. Caleb kept his expression neutral, though anger was building in his gut. Mrs. Harper is a grown woman who makes her own decisions. Mrs. Harper is family, and family looks out for each other. Victor glanced around as if checking who might be listening. I'm here to settle some estate matters, my brother's affairs, things that should have been resolved years ago. but I find myself distracted by these rumors about Lydia keeping company with a hermit rancher. It's beneath her. Maybe you should talk to her about that instead of me.
Oh, I intend to, but I wanted to meet you first. See what kind of man would take advantage of a vulnerable widow. The accusation hit like a slap. Caleb stepped closer, voice low and hard. I haven't taken advantage of anyone. Your sister-in-law comes and goes as she pleases. If you have a problem with that, take it up with her. But don't come at me with implications about things you know nothing about. I know she's throwing away her dignity for whatever this is between you. I know she's risking everything my brother left her. Your brother left her nothing but debt and a failed farm. Lydia's voice cut through the conversation like a knife. She'd appeared beside them, her face composed but her eyes blazing. And you have no right to speak for me, Victor. Not now, not ever. Victor's expression shifted to something almost pitying. Lydia, I'm only trying to protect you. I don't need your protection. I need you to go back to Boston and leave me alone. We need to talk about the estate, in private. His eyes flicked to Caleb. Away from distractions. Mr. Morgan isn't a distraction. He's my friend. Is that what you're calling it? Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes, because the town seems to think it's something else entirely. Caleb saw Lydia's hands clench into fists. Before she could respond, he put a hand on her arm, gently, a question, not a demand. She looked at him, and something passed between them. Understanding, maybe. Or just the recognition that this conversation was going nowhere good. We should go, Caleb said quietly. Yes. Lydia turned back to Victor. I'll meet you tomorrow at the boarding house to discuss whatever estate business you think is so urgent. But make no mistake, Victor, you don't get to control my life or judge my choices. Those days ended when your brother died. She walked away, and Caleb followed, aware of Victor's eyes burning into his back. They didn't speak until they'd reached the edge of town, where Lydia had left her horse tied outside the schoolhouse. I'm sorry, she said, her voice tight with anger. He had no right to say those things to you. He's worried about you. He's worried about his brother's estate and what happens to it if I remarry. She untied the reins with sharp, frustrated movements. There's money, Caleb. Not a fortune, but enough. Samuel had a life insurance policy I didn't know about, and there were investments that matured after his death. Victor's been managing it all, and now he's suddenly very interested in my personal life. Why? Because if I remarry, the terms of the estate change. I don't know the details. Victor's been vague about it, but I suspect there's a clause that limits what I can access if I take another husband. It's not uncommon in policies from that era. Men like to control their widows from beyond the grave. She looked at him, and her expression softened. He probably thinks you're after the money. Caleb let out a bitter laugh. I don't want your money. I know. But Victor doesn't know you. He just sees a poor rancher paying attention to a woman with means, and he jumps to conclusions. Are we? Paying attention to each other, I mean. The question surprised both of them. Lydia's hand stilled on the reins. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Yes, I think we are. Something in Caleb's chest loosened and tightened at the same time. I don't know what to do with that. Neither do I. She smiled sadly. But I know I'm not giving you up because Victor showed up with his suspicious and his paperwork. Whatever this is between us, it's worth more than money I never expected to have anyway. Lydia, I need to go. I'll see you Tuesday. She mounted her horse, then paused. Unless you'd rather I stop coming. If this is too complicated, if Victor's presence makes things difficult, come Tuesday, Caleb said. Please. The relief on her face told him everything he needed to know about how much this mattered to her too. She rode off, and Caleb stood in the cold February afternoon, watching her go and thinking about a man in an expensive suit who'd looked at him like he was something scraped off a boot. Victor Harper didn't know anything about what Lydia meant to him. Hell, Caleb barely understood it himself. All he knew was that the thought of her not coming back, of losing those Tuesday evenings, felt like something being torn away that he couldn't afford to lose. He rode home alone, his mind churning. The house greeted him with its usual silence, but now it felt different, heavier, like it was waiting for something. He built a fire, made coffee, sat at the table where Lydia always sat across from him. The chair looked empty in a way it never had before she'd started filling it. That night, lying in bed, Caleb forced himself to think about what was happening. He'd spent 6 years building walls around himself, convincing himself that isolation was safety,
and connection was risk. Lydia had walked through those walls like they were paper, and now he was standing in the wreckage wondering how to rebuild them, or if he even wanted to. The truth was, he didn't want to. The truth was, somewhere between that first shocked encounter and now, he'd started caring about her. Not just caring, wanting. Wanting her company, her conversation, her presence in his life. Wanting things he'd convinced himself he didn't deserve after everything he'd done and seen and failed to do. Tuesday came, and with it, a snowstorm that dumped 6 inches overnight and showed no signs of stopping. Caleb spent the morning digging out paths to the barn and checking on his cattle, making sure they had access to shelter. By afternoon, the wind had picked up to a howl, visibility dropping to nothing. No one in their right mind would be out in this weather, which meant Lydia wouldn't be coming. He told himself it was fine. One missed Tuesday wouldn't kill him. She'd be warm in town, safe in the schoolhouse or her boarding room, probably reading by a fire and thanking her luck that she wasn't stuck out here in this mess. He made himself dinner, beans and hardtack, the kind of meal he'd been eating for years before she showed up, and tried not to notice how tasteless it was. The knock on the door came just after dark. Caleb's heart jumped. He crossed the room in 3 strides and yanked the door open. Lydia stood there, covered in snow, shivering violently, her horse barely visible behind her in the white chaos. "What the hell are you doing here?" He pulled her inside, slammed the door against the wind. "It wasn't this bad when I left." Her teeth were chattering so hard she could barely speak. "I thought I could make it before it got worse. I was wrong." He got her to the fire, started peeling off her wet coat and shawl while she stood there shaking. Her hands were like ice, her lips tinged blue. Fury and fear warred in his chest. "You could have died out there." "I know. I'm sorry. I should have turned back, but I was already halfway here, and I thought—" She broke off, wrapped her arms around herself. "I wasn't thinking." Caleb threw her wet things over a chair, grabbed a blanket from the bed, and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Why? Why risk it for a Tuesday dinner?" "Because I couldn't stand the thought of you sitting here alone in the storm. Because I was afraid if I didn't come, you'd think Victor had scared me off. Because—" Her voice dropped. "Because I wanted to see you, and I was willing to risk the weather for it. Stupid, I know." He knelt in front of her, rubbing her frozen hands between his own, trying to force warmth back into them. "It's not stupid. It's terrifying. Do you understand what would have happened if you'd gotten lost out there? If your horse had thrown you? If—" "I know." She was crying now, tears mixing with melted snow on her face. "I know it was reckless, but I couldn't stop thinking about what Victor said, about how people are talking, about how maybe I'm ruining your life by being here. And I needed to see you, needed to know that you still wanted me to come, even with all the complications." Caleb looked up at her, this woman who'd ridden through a blizzard for him, and felt something break open in his chest, something he'd been holding back for months, maybe years. "Of course I want you to come," he said roughly. "I want you here more than I want anything, and that scares the hell out of me, Lydia, because I don't know how to do this. Don't know how to let someone matter again without being terrified of losing them. I'm scared too." She reached out with one trembling hand, touched his face with fingers that were finally starting to warm. "But I'm more scared of not trying." The fire crackled, the wind screamed outside, and in the small circle of warmth they'd created, Caleb made a decision that felt like jumping off a cliff with no idea if there was water below. He leaned forward and kissed her. It wasn't smooth or practiced. It was desperate and uncertain and tasted like snow and salt and everything he'd been too afraid to acknowledge. Lydia made a small sound of surprise, then kissed him back with the same fierce need, her cold hand sliding into his hair, pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lydia rested her forehead against his. "So," she whispered, "we're doing this." "Apparently." His voice was shaky, disbelieving. "I don't have anything to offer you. No money, no comfort, just a drafty cabin and a hard life." "I don't need money. I need someone who sees me as more than a widow or a teacher or a burden to be managed. I need someone who lets me be myself." She pulled back enough to meet his eyes. "Can you do that?" "I don't know how to be anything else with you." She smiled, that real smile he'd come to treasure. "Then that's enough." The storm raged all night, trapping them together in a way that felt both dangerous and inevitable. They didn't sleep. They talked instead, lying side by side on the floor in front of the fire, saying all the things they'd been dancing around for months. Caleb told her about the nightmares, the guilt, the feeling that he didn't deserve happiness after everything he'd done in the war. Lydia told him about the loneliness of her marriage, the relief mixed with shame when Samuel died, the fear that she'd never find anyone who wanted her for herself and not what she could provide.
"Victor's going to make trouble," she said, as dawn light started filtering through the windows. "When he finds out about us. Let him. It might cost me the inheritance. Then we'll manage without it. I've been managing on nothing for years." She turned to look at him. "You'd really do that? Give up the security that money could bring?" "I'd give up anything except you." He said it simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "I spent 6 years trying to not need anyone. Turns out, I just needed the right person." Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me, and we're lying on a dirty floor in a cabin that probably has rats in the walls." "There aren't rats." "There better not be. I'm choosing you over financial security. The least you can do is promise me a rodent-free home." He laughed, and it felt like something fundamental had shifted, like he'd been holding his breath for years and could finally exhale. The storm cleared by mid-morning. They stood in the doorway together, looking out at a world transformed by snow, and Caleb knew that everything had changed. They'd crossed a line they couldn't uncross, made a choice that would have consequences they couldn't predict. Victor would fight them. The town would gossip. There would be obstacles and complications, and probably pain. But as Lydia leaned against him, her hand finding his, Caleb thought maybe, just maybe, some things were worth fighting for after all. They rode into town together 3 days later, and it felt like walking into a firing squad. Lydia had insisted on going back to the schoolhouse the morning after the storm, despite Caleb's arguments that she should wait another day. She'd kissed him goodbye at the door, still strange, still thrilling, still terrifying, and promised to handle Victor herself. But Caleb knew that whatever confrontation was coming, she shouldn't face it alone. So he'd cleaned himself up, put on his least worn shirt, and ridden in to find her. He found her at the boarding house, standing in the small parlor across from Victor Harper, whose face had gone the color of old meat. "Absolutely not," Victor was saying as Caleb walked in. "I won't allow it." "You don't have a say in what I allow or don't allow." Lydia's voice was steel-wrapped in silk. "I'm not asking for your permission, Victor. I'm informing you of my decision. Your decision to throw away everything Samuel provided for you? To marry some—" Victor's eyes landed on Caleb in the doorway, and his lip curled. "Some dirt-poor rancher who probably can't even read?" "I can read just fine," Caleb said quietly. "And I'm not marrying Lydia for money, if that's what you're implying." "Then you're a fool as well as poor." Victor turned back to Lydia. "Do you understand what you're giving up? The insurance policy has a remarriage clause. If you marry this man, you forfeit 70% of the settlement. 70%, Lydia, that's thousands of dollars." Lydia didn't flinch. "I don't care." "You should care. That money could give you independence, security, a comfortable life. Instead, you're choosing poverty with a man you barely know." "I know him better than I ever knew your brother." The words came out sharp, cutting. "Samuel was a good man, but he was your brother first and my husband second. Every decision we made, he consulted you first. Every dollar we spent, you questioned. When he died, you swooped in to manage his affairs like I was incapable of handling my own life. I'm done with that, Victor. Done with men who think they know what's best for me." Victor's face darkened. "I'm trying to protect you from making a terrible mistake." "No. You're trying to protect the money you've been controlling for the past 3 years. I'm not stupid, Victor. I know you've been drawing fees from the estate for management services. How much have you taken? 10%? 15%? The silence that followed was damning. Victor's jaw worked, but no words came out. "That's what I thought." Lydia picked up her shawl from the chair. "I want a full accounting of the estate, every penny in and out, delivered to me by the end of the week. And then I want you to transfer whatever remains into my name, free and clear. If you marry him, the policy stipulations, then I'll take the 30% I'm entitled to and build a life with it. It's more than I had 3 years ago, and it's more than Caleb's ever had. We'll manage." Victor looked at Caleb with pure venom. "You're making her do this, poisoning her against her own family." "I'm not making her do anything," Caleb said. "Your sister-in-law has a mind of her own.
Maybe you should start respecting it. Respect? You want me to respect this? Victor gestured between them. A school teacher and a hermit playing house in the wilderness? It's pathetic. She's throwing away her future for, what, companionship? There are men in Boston who would court her properly, men of standing and means.
Men you would approve of, Lydia cut in. Men who would let you continue managing the money. That's what this is really about, isn't it? You're not worried about my happiness or my future. You're worried about losing control. Victor's composure finally cracked. I'm worried about you making the same mistake twice. Samuel married you when you had nothing, gave you everything, and you repaid him by being relieved when he died.
The slap echoed through the small room. Lydia's hand had moved before Caleb could react, connecting with Victor's cheek hard enough to snap his head to the side. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Lydia stepped back, her hand shaking, her face white with rage. How dare you, she whispered. How dare you use Samuel's death against me? I grieved for your brother. I nursed him through the drinking and the nightmares, and the times he couldn't remember my name because the war had broken something inside him. I held him when he died, and I cried at his grave, and I've spent 3 years trying to build something from the wreckage he left behind. Don't you dare suggest I didn't care about him. Then honor his memory by making a sensible choice. I am making a sensible choice. I'm choosing someone who sees me as a partner, not a burden to be managed. Someone who doesn't need to control my money to prove his worth. She looked at Caleb, and her expression softened. Someone who came looking for me in a snowstorm because he was worried, not because he wanted to lecture me about inheritance clauses. Caleb moved to her side, not touching her, but close enough that Victor would understand they were united. We're leaving. Send the accounting to the schoolhouse when it's ready. They walked out together, Victor's stunned silence following them into the street. Caleb didn't speak until they'd reached his horse, tied outside the general store where the new owner, Thomas Greer's nephew, was watching through the window with undisguised curiosity. You didn't have to do that, he said. Give up the money, I mean. We could have waited, figured out another way. There is no other way. Victor's right about the policy terms. I checked with a lawyer last year when I first found out about the inheritance. If I remarry, the payout drops significantly. It's an old provision designed to discourage widows from jumping into new marriages. She looked up at him, her eyes still bright with anger and something else. But it's my choice to make, not his, and I choose you. Even if it means struggling? I've been struggling my whole life, Caleb. Poverty with someone I love sounds better than comfort with people who think they own me. The word love hung between them, unsaid but implied, too big and frightening to speak out loud yet. Caleb wanted to say it back, wanted to tell her that he felt the same terrifying, wonderful thing growing in his chest. Instead, he took her hand, right there on the main street where anyone could see, and squeezed it gently. We should talk to the lawyer ourselves. Make sure we understand what we're getting into. Already made an appointment for tomorrow. She smiled, that fierce, determined smile that made his heart do strange things. I told you, I'm not stupid. I want to know exactly what this costs before we commit to it. The lawyer's office occupied a cramped room above the saloon, which said something about the quality of legal representation available in Montana territory. Edward Mills was young, probably fresh from some Eastern law school, trying to build a practice in a place where most disputes were settled with fists or bullets rather than briefs and arguments. But he seemed competent enough as he spread the insurance documents across his desk and walked them through the terms. The remarriage clause is standard for policies written in the 60s and 70s, Mills explained, adjusting his spectacles. Life insurance was meant to provide for a widow in the absence of a husband, not to give her independent means. If she remarried, the assumption was that her new husband would provide for her, so the payout decreased accordingly. By 70%, Lydia said. That seems excessive. It is excessive by modern standards, but the policy was written in 1868, and the company that issued it no longer exists. It was absorbed by a larger firm in New York, which means the terms are ironclad. They're not going to renegotiate. Caleb leaned forward. What's the total amount we're talking about? Mills checked his papers. The original death benefit was $5,000 plus accumulated interest over 3 years. At the full rate, Mrs. Harper would receive approximately $5,800. With the remarriage reduction, it drops to $1,740. The numbers made Caleb's head spin. He'd never had more than a few $100s to his name at any one time. $1,700 was still more money than he'd see in 5 years of ranching, but over $4,000 lost. That was staggering. What about the management fees? Lydia asked. Victor's been administering the estate. How much has he taken?
Mills looked uncomfortable. Mr. Harper's fees have been substantial. Based on these records, he's withdrawn approximately $800 over 3 years for various administrative costs. $800? Lydia's voice could have cut glass. For what? Sending me quarterly letters telling me the money was being properly invested?
The fees are technically legal under the management agreement you signed when your husband died, but they're on the high end of acceptable. A good attorney could probably argue they're excessive and recover some of it, but that would require litigation, which would be costly and time-consuming. So Victor's stolen $800 from me, and there's nothing I can do about it. Not stolen, exactly, but definitely taken advantage of the situation. Mills set down the papers. Mrs. Harper, may I speak frankly? Please. If you marry Mr. Morgan, you'll receive $1,740 minus any remaining fees Mr. Harper claims before the transfer. That's probably $1,600, give or take. It's not nothing, but it's not enough to live on indefinitely. You'll still need to work, or Mr. Morgan will need to make his ranch profitable enough to support 2 people. I understand that. Do you? Because I've seen women make similar choices, and they often regret them when the reality sets in. $1,600 sounds like a lot until you need to repair a roof or replace livestock or survive a bad season. It goes faster than you think. Lydia's hand found Caleb's under the table, squeezed hard. I'm not afraid of work, Mr. Mills, and I'm not making this choice blindly. I know what I'm giving up and what I'm gaining. Mills nodded slowly. Then I'll draw up the necessary paperwork to finalize the estate transfer and remove Mr. Harper as administrator. It'll take about a week. Once that's done, the money will be yours to do with as you please. They left the lawyer's office in silence, walking side by side down the wooden sidewalk. The afternoon sun was warm for February, melting the snow into muddy rivers that ran along the street. People stared as they passed, the school teacher and the hermit rancher walking together like they had every right to. Caleb could feel the weight of their judgment, their curiosity, their disapproval. They're talking about us, Lydia said quietly. Let them talk. It's going to get worse when we announce the engagement. The school board might fire me. Then we'll figure something else out. He stopped walking, turned to face her. Lydia, I need you to be sure about this, really sure, because once we do this, there's no going back. Victor will make sure you never see that full inheritance. The town will make your life difficult, and I can't promise you comfort or security or any of the things that money could buy. What can you promise me? The question caught him off guard. He thought about it seriously, looking for honest answers instead of pretty words. I can promise I'll work myself to death trying to build something good. I can promise I'll never lie to you or try to control you the way Victor did. I can promise that when things get hard, and they will get hard, I won't run. He paused. And I can promise that loving you scares me more than anything I faced in the war, but I'm going to do it anyway. Tears spilled down her cheeks. That's all I need. They announced their engagement the following Sunday at church. Caleb hadn't been to a service in 6 years, but Lydia insisted they do this properly, face the town together rather than letting gossip control the narrative. So he put on his best clothes, which still looked shabby compared to everyone else, and walked into the small wooden church with Lydia on his arm. The whispers started immediately. Heads turned. Women leaned together, hands covering their mouths as they spoke behind their fingers. Men's eyes tracked Caleb with suspicion and something else, maybe envy, maybe judgment. He felt like a specimen under glass, something strange and vaguely threatening that had wandered into civilized society. After the service, the minister, a thin man named Reverend Porter, who'd only been in town a year, approached them with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mrs. Harper, Mr. Morgan, I understand congratulations are in order. Thank you, Reverend, Lydia said. Her hand was tight on Caleb's arm, but her voice was steady. We'd like to schedule the wedding for late March, if that's acceptable. Late March. I see. Porter's smile tightened. Perhaps we should discuss this in private. My office is available. They followed him to a small room behind the pulpit, where Porter settled himself behind a desk that was too large for the space. He steepled his fingers, looking at them over his spectacles. I'll be direct, he said. There are concerns about this union. What concerns? Caleb asked. The speed, primarily. You've known each other, what, a few months? That's hardly enough time to build the foundation for a lifelong commitment. My late husband and I knew each other for 3 weeks before we married, Lydia said. Time isn't always the best measure of compatibility. Perhaps. But there are also questions about propriety. Mrs. Harper has been visiting your ranch unchaperoned, Mr. Morgan, regularly. The school board has expressed concerns about whether someone engaged in such behavior is a suitable influence for impressionable children. The threat was barely veiled. Caleb felt anger surge hot in his chest, but Lydia spoke before he could. Are you saying the school board intends to terminate my employment? I'm saying there are discussions happening. If the marriage proceeds, it might resolve some of those concerns. A married woman is less vulnerable to speculation. And if we delay the marriage? If we wait the 6 months or year that you seem to think is appropriate? Porter shifted uncomfortably. Then the board would likely need to make a decision about your continued employment sooner rather than later. They can't have a teacher whose moral character is being questioned by half the town. So we're being forced to marry quickly or I lose my job. Is that what you're saying? I'm saying that marriage would resolve the impropriety. Whether that happens in March or June is your decision, but the board won't wait indefinitely for resolution. Caleb stood up, his chair scraping loud against the floor. We're done here. Mr. Morgan. No, we're done. You want to judge us? Fine. Judge us. But we're not going to sit here and be threatened into doing things on your timeline. He looked at Lydia. We're getting married in March because that's when we want to get married, not because some board of moral arbiters decided to blackmail you into it. They left before Porter could respond, walking out through the church, where people were still gathered in small groups talking in low voices that fell silent as Caleb and Lydia passed. Outside, the February sunshine felt like a lie, bright and warm on the surface, but with winter still lurking underneath. I'm sorry, Lydia said once they were away from listening ears. I should have known they'd do this. It's not your fault. Yes, it is. I was careless. I didn't think about how it would look. Me riding out to your place every week. I just wanted... She stopped, voice breaking. I just wanted something for myself. Something that wasn't shaped by what other people thought I should want. Caleb pulled her into an alley between the church and the general store, where they had some privacy from prying eyes. You didn't do anything wrong. We didn't do anything wrong. And I'll be damned if I let a bunch of small-minded people make you feel ashamed for finding happiness. They're going to fire me anyway, even if we get married. Maybe, or maybe they'll back down once we're properly wed and there's nothing left to gossip about. He tipped her chin up, made her look at him. Either way, we'll figure it out. You're a good teacher. Someone else will hire you if this town won't. And if they won't, then we'll find another way to make it work. With $1,600 and a struggling ranch? We've both survived on less. She laughed, but it came out wet and shaky. This is madness, you know that? We're throwing away money and security and my job, all for something that might not even work out. It'll work out. How can you be sure? Because I've never been sure of anything in my life except the war would kill me and I'd die alone. And I was wrong about both of those things. So maybe I'm right about this. He kissed her forehead gently. Maybe we're both right. They spent the rest of February preparing for the wedding and bracing for the fallout. Victor sent the accounting, along with a bitter letter pointing out that Lydia was making the biggest mistake of her life and he wouldn't be responsible for the consequences. The final number came to $1,623 after all fees and deductions, less than they'd hoped, more than Caleb had ever imagined having. The school board called a meeting. Lydia attended alone despite Caleb's offer to go with her. She came back 3 hours later, her face pale but composed. They're letting me finish the school year, she said. After that, my contract won't be renewed. They were very polite about it. Said they appreciated my service but felt it was best if I focused on my new marriage rather than dividing my attention. Cowards couldn't even admit the real reason. The real reason is that I'm not respectable anymore. A widow marrying a poor rancher she barely knows, giving up a substantial inheritance in the process. It makes people uncomfortable. It raises questions about my judgment. She set down her bag, moved to the stove where Caleb had been making a pathetic attempt at dinner. They're wrong, but I understand why they're concerned. You're defending them? I'm acknowledging their perspective. It doesn't mean I agree with it. She took the spoon from his hand, tasted whatever was in the pot, and made a face. What is this supposed to be?
Stew. It's not stew. It's punishment in a pot. She started adding things. Salt, some dried herbs she'd brought from town, a bit of flour to thicken it. They offered me a compromise, actually. Said if we postponed the wedding for a year, showed we were serious about the commitment, they'd reconsider the contract termination. Caleb went still. What did you say?
I said no, obviously. I'm not putting my life on hold for their approval. She stirred the pot with more force than necessary. But it made me think about what we're doing, the speed of it. Are we rushing because we're sure, or because we're being pushed into it? Does it matter? Yes, it matters. I don't want to marry you because the town's forcing our hand. I want to marry you because it's what we both want. Caleb came up behind her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel his presence. I want to marry you because you walked into my house uninvited and reminded me what it felt like to be human. Because you rode through a blizzard to bring me dinner. Because when I look at you, I see someone who understands what it costs to survive, but chose to live anyway. He paused. And yeah, maybe we're rushing. Maybe in another time, another place, we'd court properly for a year and everyone would approve. But we're not in another time. We're here, now. And I don't want to wait. Lydia turned in his arms, searched his face. Promise me something. Anything. Promise me that if this gets too hard, if the money runs out or the ranch fails or we can't make it work, promise me you'll tell me instead of just enduring silently. I can't go through another marriage where my husband suffers in silence because he thinks he's protecting me. I promise. But you have to promise the same thing. If you regret giving up the inheritance, if you miss teaching, if you wake up one day and realize you made a mistake, tell me. Don't just stick it out because you think you have to. I promise. They sealed it with a kiss that tasted like salt and almost stew in the future they were building together, uncertain and terrifying and absolutely worth it. The next weeks passed in a blur of preparation. They bought a simple gold band from the jeweler, all Caleb could afford, though Lydia insisted it was perfect. They cleaned the ranch house together, making it ready for 2 people instead of 1. Caleb repaired the roof, fixed the porch he'd been ignoring for years, even built a small addition for storage so Lydia would have space for her books and teaching materials. She brought over her few possessions gradually, clothes, books, her mother's old quilt, until the cabin started to look less like a bachelor's survival shelter and more like a home. Victor left town without saying goodbye, taking his moral judgment and his expensive suits back to Boston. Before he left, though, he made one final attempt to change Lydia's mind, showing up at the schoolhouse with papers that supposedly proved Caleb had debts he hadn't disclosed. He's not who you think he is, Victor had said, spreading the documents across her desk. He owes money to a bank in Helena, over $300. He's probably marrying you to clear his debts with your inheritance. Lydia had looked at the papers, which were real as it turned out, then looked at Victor with something close to pity. I know about the debt. Caleb told me last week. It's from a bad cattle deal 2 years ago that he's been paying off slowly. He was embarrassed to tell me initially, but he did tell me because, unlike some people, he doesn't believe in controlling someone through selective information. She'd gathered the papers and handed them back. Go home, Victor. Your brother is dead, and I'm not yours to manage. Let it go. When she told Caleb about the confrontation later, he'd been mortified that Victor had found out about the debt at all. How did he even know? He probably hired someone to investigate you. That's what men like Victor do when they can't control a situation. They look for leverage. She'd taken his hands, made him look at her. I don't care about the debt, Caleb. We'll pay it off together. That's what partners do. It changes the math. $1,600 minus $300 is still $1,300, which is still more than either of us had before. Stop trying to talk me out of this. It's not going to work. The wedding was set for the last Saturday in March, outdoors at Caleb's ranch, because neither of them wanted to give the church the satisfaction of hosting them after Reverend Porter's threats. Lydia invited a few friends from town, mostly women who'd stood by her despite the gossip, and Caleb invited exactly no one because he didn't have anyone to invite. The ceremony would be small, simple, witnessed by the handful of people who actually cared about them rather than the spectacle. The night before the wedding, lying alone in his bed for the last time, Caleb thought about how much had changed since that November day when he'd come home to find smoke in his chimney.
He'd been so angry at first, so violated by the intrusion into his carefully constructed solitude. Now he couldn't imagine going back to that life. The silence, the emptiness, the slow erosion of everything that made him feel human. Lydia had saved him, he thought, not in some grand dramatic way, but in the small daily ways that actually mattered. She'd shown him that isolation wasn't safety, it was just another kind of death. And tomorrow, he'd promised to spend the rest of his life returning that favor, reminding her that she was worth more than money or social approval, that her choice to live rather than just survive was the bravest thing he'd ever witnessed. He fell asleep thinking about gold rings and vows, and the woman who'd be his wife by this time tomorrow. And for the first time in years, his dreams were something close to peaceful. Morning came with wind that rattled the shutters and clouds that promised rain by afternoon. Caleb stood at his window, watching the sky lighten from black to gray, and wondered if the weather was an omen or just Montana being Montana. Either way, they were getting married today, storm or no storm. He'd been awake since 4, unable to sleep past the habitual hour his body had learned over years of ranching. The house felt strange, too quiet, too full of anticipation. In a few hours, Lydia would be here permanently, and this cabin would stop being his and become theirs. The thought was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. He made coffee, burned the first pot because he wasn't paying attention, made another, shaved carefully, nicking himself twice because his hands weren't steady. Put on the new shirt Lydia had insisted on buying him, white cotton, nicer than anything he'd owned in years, and still not good enough for what she deserved. But she'd picked it out herself, so he wore it. The first guests arrived just after 9. Martha Chen, who ran the boarding house where Lydia had been living, came in a wagon with her husband and 2 daughters. Behind them came the Pritchards, the family who'd lent Lydia their horse that first night, with their brood of 5 children ranging from 6 to 16. Then Sarah Mitchell, another teacher who'd defended Lydia to the school board even though it probably cost her standing with the town's more judgmental residents. They gathered near the house, the women setting out food on a makeshift table Caleb had built the day before, the men standing awkwardly and pretending to admire his carpentry while avoiding eye contact. Caleb recognized the discomfort. They were here for Lydia, not for him, and nobody quite knew how to treat a hermit who'd suddenly decided to rejoin society. "Nice place you have," John Pritchard said eventually. "Good grazing land." "It does all right." Caleb watched the road for signs of Lydia. She'd spent last night at the boarding house, proper tradition, even if nothing else about this wedding was traditional. "Heard you've got that Helena debt nearly paid off." Caleb's jaw tightened. Of course people knew. Victor had probably made sure everyone knew, one last parting gift to poison the well. "Working on it. No shame in debt. Every rancher I know has carried some at one time or another. Land out here doesn't give up easy." Pritchard paused, then added in a lower voice, "My wife thinks I'm crazy for coming today. Half the town does. But Lydia helped our daughter learn to read when everyone else had given up on her. Said Jenny was smart, just learned different. Spent extra hours after school, never asked for extra pay. That's worth more than whatever gossip the church ladies are spreading." Caleb looked at the man surprised. "Thank you for saying that." "Just being honest. Lydia's a good woman. Hope you know what you've got there." "I do." More wagons arrived. Not many, maybe 15 people total, which felt like a crowd to Caleb but was probably a small gathering by normal wedding standards. He spotted faces he recognized from town, people who'd given him a wide berth for 6 years and were now here bearing witness to his marriage. Some looked genuinely happy. Others looked curious, like they were attending a show and waiting to see if it would end in tragedy or triumph. Then Lydia arrived, and Caleb forgot about everyone else. She came in the Chen's second wagon, driven by Martha's oldest son. She wore a dress he'd never seen before, deep blue wool, simple but well-fitted, with her mother's cameo pinned at the throat. Her hair was down, falling past her shoulders in dark waves that the wind immediately started tangling. She looked nervous and determined and absolutely beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with fashion or conventional prettiness and everything to do with the fierce intelligence in her eyes. Martha helped her down from the wagon. Lydia spotted Caleb standing near the house and smiled, not the polite social smile she used with strangers, but the real one that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. He felt something in his chest crack open wider, making room for feelings he still didn't have proper names for. She walked toward him, alone, because there was no father to give her away,
and she'd told him weeks ago that she belonged to herself and was giving herself freely. When she reached him, she took his hands, squeezed once, hard. "You look terrified," she whispered. "I am terrified." "Good. Me too." Reverend Porter hadn't come, which was fine with both of them. Instead, the circuit judge, a weathered man named Howard Beck, who traveled between settlements performing marriages and settling disputes, stood under the cottonwood tree where Caleb had buried his first dog years ago. Beck had a pragmatic view of frontier marriage. Keep it simple, make it legal, and don't waste time on flowery speeches when there was weather coming. The ceremony lasted maybe 10 minutes. Beck read the standard vows from a worn book, asked the required questions, declared them married under the laws of Montana Territory. Caleb slipped the simple gold band onto Lydia's finger, his hands shaking slightly, and she did the same for him. Then Beck said, "You may kiss your bride." And Caleb did, aware of 15 pairs of eyes watching, but somehow not caring because this was Lydia, his wife, and the rest of the world could think what it wanted. The gathering cheered, a small sound in the vast Montana openness, but genuine. Martha Chen was crying openly. Sarah Mitchell was grinning. The Pritchard children were already eyeing the food table with predatory interest. "Well," Lydia said against his mouth, quiet enough that only he could hear. "We did it. No going back now. Wouldn't want to, even if we could." They broke apart, and for a moment Caleb felt dizzy with the enormity of what they'd just done. He was married. After 6 years of solitude and a lifetime of believing he didn't deserve this kind of happiness, he was married to a woman who'd chosen him over money and security and social approval. The celebration that followed was modest. Food, conversation, no alcohol, because Beck didn't approve of drinking at weddings and nobody wanted to argue with the judge. The women clustered around Lydia, asking about her plans for the house, offering advice about ranch life that Caleb suspected she didn't need but accepted graciously anyway. The men talked crops and weather and carefully avoided mentioning the elephant in the room, that Caleb had married a woman with money and debts that would eat most of it. Around noon, a wagon appeared on the road from town. Everyone turned to look, conversations dying mid-sentence. Caleb felt Lydia stiffen beside him. They were both thinking the same thing. Victor had come back to make trouble, but it wasn't Victor. The wagon pulled up, and a man in an expensive suit climbed down. Not Victor's suit, a different cut. Eastern, but not Boston. He was older, maybe 60, with gray hair and the kind of face that suggested he'd spent a lifetime negotiating deals and rarely losing. He approached with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "Mrs. Harper?" he said, looking at Lydia. "Or I suppose it's Mrs. Morgan now. Congratulations on your marriage." "Who are you?" Caleb stepped slightly in front of Lydia, protective instinct kicking in. "James Whitmore. I'm an attorney representing the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company of New York." He pulled papers from his coat pocket. "I apologize for the intrusion on your wedding day, but I've been trying to locate Mrs. Harper, Mrs. Morgan, for several weeks. Your brother-in-law proved remarkably unhelpful." Lydia moved to Caleb's side. "What's this about?" "It's about your late husband's insurance policy. There's been a development." Whitmore unfolded the papers. "Victor Harper submitted a claim 18 months ago for administrative fees that we flagged as potentially fraudulent. We've been investigating since then. Turns out Mr. Harper has been systematically overcharging estates he manages, skimming funds under the guise of legitimate expenses. Your estate was one of several." The gathering had gone completely silent now. Everyone was listening, making no pretense of privacy. "How much did he take?" Lydia's voice was steady, but Caleb could feel her trembling. "From you? About $1,200 over 3 years, over and above the legitimate fees he was entitled to. We've recovered most of it, along with interest, and we're prepared to release the full amount to you immediately." Whitmore produced another document. "Which brings me to the other matter. We've reviewed the remarriage clause in the policy, and our legal department has determined it's unenforceable under current New York state law. The company that issued the original policy no longer exists, and when we absorbed their obligations, we didn't absorb their discriminatory provisions. The full death benefit is yours, Mrs. Morgan, regardless of your marital status." Caleb felt the ground shift under his feet. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Mrs. Morgan is entitled to the full $5,800, plus the $1,200 we recovered from her brother-in-law's fraud, plus 3 years of accumulated interest. The total comes to approximately $7,200. Whitmore held out the papers. All I need is your signature acknowledging receipt, and I can arrange for the funds to be transferred to whatever bank you specify. $7,200. The number was incomprehensible. That was more than most people in Montana saw in a decade. That was security, opportunity, freedom from the constant worry about bad seasons and failed crops and debts that never quite got paid off. Lydia took the papers with shaking hands. This can't be real. It's very real and long overdue. Victor Harper will be facing legal consequences for his actions, though that's a separate matter. For now, I'm authorized to settle your claim in full. Whitmore paused. I understand this is unexpected, particularly today, but I thought you'd want to know as soon as possible. Does Victor know about this? Caleb asked. Not yet. We wanted to notify Mrs. Morgan first, given that he's no longer her legal representative. He'll be informed once the transfer is complete, and he can't interfere further. Whitmore tipped his hat. Again, congratulations on your marriage. I'll leave these documents with you to review. When you're ready, contact our Helena office and we'll finalize everything. He left as abruptly as he'd arrived, climbing back into his wagon and driving off while 15 witnesses stood in stunned silence. Lydia stared at the papers in her hands like they might disappear if she looked away. $7,200, she whispered. Martha Chen broke the silence with a laugh. Well, that's quite a wedding present. Everyone started talking at once, voices rising in excitement and disbelief. The Pritchards were congratulating them. Sarah Mitchell was declaring it justice finally served. The men were calculating out loud what a person could do with that kind of money. Buy land, expand a herd, build a real house instead of a cabin. Caleb pulled Lydia away from the crowd, walked her toward the ridge overlooking his property. Their property now. Everything had shifted again, the ground rearranging itself under their feet. Are you all right? He asked when they had privacy. I don't know. I think so. Maybe? She looked at the papers again. Victor stole from me. For 3 years he stole from me and made me feel like I should be grateful he was managing things. He'll pay for it. That's not what I'm upset about. I'm upset that I trusted him, that I let him make me feel small and incapable, and like I needed his help to function, that I was ready to give up thousands of dollars rather than keep dealing with his control. She turned to face Caleb, and I'm upset that now everything's different. Different how? We got married believing we'd have $1,600 and a hard life. We made that choice knowing what it cost. Now we have $7,200, and suddenly people will say you married me for money after all. Caleb took her face in his hands, made her look at him. I don't give a damn what people say. I married you before we knew about this money. Every person here witnessed that. And if anyone suggests I knew about it beforehand, they can take it up with me directly. But it changes things, Caleb. That kind of money, we could pay off your debt entirely, expand the ranch, maybe buy the Henderson property that borders yours. We could hire help. We could travel. We could do whatever you want. It's your money. It's our money. We're married. What's mine is yours. He shook his head. That money came from your husband's death and Victor's fraud. I didn't earn it, didn't suffer for it. I'm not taking it just because we're married. So what? I'm supposed to have $7,200 that you refuse to benefit from? That's ridiculous. She pulled away from him, frustrated. I didn't give up the inheritance to prove a point about money not mattering. I gave it up because I was choosing you over Victor's control. Now I have the money anyway, and you're trying to control it by refusing to let me share it? I'm not trying to control anything. I just don't want you to think, what? That you're like every other man who sees me as a bank account with a vagina. I don't think that, Caleb. I've never thought that. You proved what you wanted when you asked me to marry you, thinking we'd have nothing. Her voice softened. But we do have something now. A lot of something. And I want to use it to build the life we planned, just with fewer worries about starving if the crops fail. Caleb ran his hand through his hair, trying to organize thoughts that kept slipping sideways. I don't know how to do this. Be married, make joint decisions, share resources. I've been alone so long I don't trust myself not to mess it up. Then we'll mess it up together. She took his hands. Look, we don't have to decide anything today. We just got married, there's a lawyer who appeared out of nowhere with life-changing news, and we have guests who are probably eating all the food right now. Let's just get through today. We can figure out the money tomorrow. Tomorrow?
he agreed, relieved to have a reprieve from decisions that felt too big for his capacity to process. They walked back to find the party had taken on new energy. The revelation about the inheritance had shifted something, made their marriage seem less scandalous, more romantic. A widow choosing love over money was one thing, but a widow getting both love and money felt like the ending everyone wanted. People were laughing, talking about how Victor Harper had gotten what he deserved, speculating about what the newlyweds would do with their fortune. "It's not a fortune," Caleb heard John Pritchard say. "It's a good stake, sure, but not enough to retire on. They'll still have to work the ranch." "Still better than most folks get," someone else responded. "Morgan's lucky. Beautiful wife and money, too." Martha Chen appeared at Caleb's elbow. "Don't listen to the gossips. Everyone knows you didn't marry her for money. You barely talked to anyone in town until she came along. You were probably the only man here who didn't know she had an inheritance coming. Didn't even know she existed until she broke into my house," Caleb said. Martha laughed. "That's right, I heard about that. Thomas Greer gave her the key, said Morgan needed someone to check on him. Thomas was a good judge of character. He knew what you both needed before either of you did." The afternoon wore on. The promised rain held off, though the wind kept threatening it. People drifted away gradually. Families with young children first, then the others, until only Martha and Sarah remained to help clean up. "You should go," Lydia told them. "You've done enough. Thank you for being here." Sarah hugged her tight. "Be happy. That's all the thanks I need. And ignore whatever the school board says. You're better than that job anyway." Martha kissed her cheek. "Marriage is hard work, honey. Some days you'll wonder why you did it. But if you chose right, and I think you did, those days will be outnumbered by the good ones." Then they were alone, Caleb and Lydia, standing in front of the cabin they now shared officially. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed too dramatic for real life. Caleb thought about all the sunsets he'd watched alone, never appreciating them because beauty without someone to share it felt pointless. "We're married," Lydia said, as if testing the reality of it. "We are. And we're apparently rich. Wouldn't go that far, but we're not poor." She turned to him, something mischievous in her expression. "You know what we should do?" "What?" "Something absolutely scandalous, something that would make the church ladies faint if they knew." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." "We should go inside, close the door, and not think about money or Victor or gossiping neighbors or anything else except the fact that we're married and we have the whole night ahead of us." She stepped closer. "What do you think?" He thought his heart might explode from how much he wanted exactly that. "I think that's the best idea I've heard all day." They went inside together, closing the door on the rest of the world. Caleb lit the lamps while Lydia unpinned her hair, letting it fall loose around her shoulders. The cabin looked different somehow. Warmer, more alive. Like it had been waiting for this moment to become a real home instead of just shelter. "I'm nervous," Lydia admitted. "Is that stupid? I was married before. I shouldn't be nervous." "I'm terrified," Caleb said. "So if you're stupid, I'm worse." She laughed, some of the tension breaking. "At least we're honest about it." They stood there awkwardly for a moment. Two people who'd shared meals and conversation and even kisses, but were now facing the intimacy of an actual wedding night. Caleb wanted to do this right, wanted to make her feel cherished and desired and safe. But he didn't know how. His experience was limited to fumbling encounters before the war and a few awkward transactions afterward that he'd regretted immediately. Lydia solved the problem by crossing the space between them and kissing him. Not tentative or questioning, but with clear intent. He responded instinctively, pulling her closer, feeling the warmth of her body against his, and the way she fit in his arms like she'd been designed specifically for that purpose. "Better," she murmured against his mouth. "Much better." They made it to the bed eventually, shedding clothes and inhibitions in equal measure. It wasn't graceful or perfect. There were awkward angles and nervous laughter and moments where they had to stop and readjust and figure out what worked. But it was real and honest. And by the time they finally collapsed together, tangled in sheets and each other, Caleb felt something settle in his chest that he'd been missing for years. "That was—" Lydia trailed off, searching for words. "Yeah," Caleb agreed, because he didn't have better words either. She propped herself up on one elbow, traced patterns on his chest. "I know we said we'd talk about the money tomorrow, but can I say one thing about it now?" "All right. I want to use it to make this place better. Not fancy. I don't need fancy. But functional. A bigger barn so you can expand the herd. Maybe hire some seasonal help so you're not killing yourself every harvest. Fix the roof properly instead of patching it every spring. She paused. And I want to save enough that if we have children, they won't grow up wondering if there will be food on the table. Children. The word hit Caleb like a physical blow. He hadn't let himself think that far ahead, hadn't believed he deserved that kind of future. But lying here with Lydia, her hand resting over his heart, he could suddenly imagine it. Children with her intelligence and his stubbornness, growing up in a house filled with love instead of silence. I'd like that, he said quietly. All of it. Good, because I already made a list. She grinned at his expression. What? You think I wasn't planning how to spend that money the second Whitmore mentioned it? I've been poor, Caleb. When money appears, you plan immediately before it disappears again. You made a list during our wedding? I made a list before the wedding, just in case we got any of the inheritance. I'm practical, not romantic. You're both, Caleb said, pulling her down for another kiss. And I love that about you. The word love slipped out before he could stop it. Lydia went still, her eyes widening. You love me? Caleb's heart hammered. Too soon, probably. Too much, definitely. But true, nonetheless. Yeah, I do. I know it's fast. I know we should probably wait and be sensible about it, but I love you too, she interrupted. Have for weeks. Was just waiting for you to figure it out. Relief and joy crashed over him in equal measure. Why didn't you say something? Because you needed to get there yourself. I couldn't push you into it. She kissed him softly. But I'm glad you got there. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other in the narrow bed, the lamplight burning low and the wind still rattling the shutters. Outside, Montana stretched endlessly in all directions, hard land that demanded everything from the people who tried to tame it. But inside, two people who'd been alone too long had found something worth more than money or security or social approval. They'd found each other. And for now, that was enough. Morning came with actual rain, the storm that had been threatening finally arriving in sheets of gray water that turned the yard to mud and made the roof leak in two new places. Caleb woke to the sound of dripping and found Lydia already up, positioning pots under the leaks with the practical efficiency of someone who'd dealt with worse. Welcome to married life, she said cheerfully. Your roof is terrible. Our roof. You married into terrible roof ownership. Fine. Our terrible roof, which we're fixing immediately with the insurance money, because I refuse to spend the next 5 years catching rainwater in pots. They spent the morning like that, finding problems, making plans, adjusting to the strange new reality of being married and relatively wealthy and responsible for decisions that would affect both of them. It wasn't easy. They argued about priorities, about whether to pay off the Helena debt immediately or invest in improvements first. Lydia wanted security before expansion. Caleb wanted to prove he could manage the ranch without needing her money as a safety net. That's pride talking, Lydia said, frustrated. Stupid pride that's going to cost us more in the long run. Maybe, but it's my pride. I need to do this my way. It's not just your way anymore. It's our way. That's what marriage means. They glared at each other across the table where they'd shared so many meals. And Caleb realized this was what Martha had warned them about. The hard days when you wondered why you'd done this. Except even angry and frustrated, he didn't regret marrying Lydia. He just regretted not knowing how to be married properly. I'm sorry, he said finally. You're right. It's our money, our decisions. I'm not used to this. Neither am I. But we'll figure it out. She reached across the table, took his hand. Together, even when we want to strangle each other. Especially then. They compromised. Pay off half the debt immediately, invest the rest in practical improvements. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. A decision made jointly, imperfectly, as partners trying to figure out how to build a life together. Outside, the rain continued, washing away the traces of yesterday's celebration and leaving behind clean earth and the promise of growth. Inside, two people who'd been strangers less than 6 months ago worked side by side, building something that looked like a future. The first year of marriage taught Caleb that love and compatibility were two different things, and having both didn't mean everything would be easy. They fought about small things that revealed bigger things. Lydia wanted to plant a garden in the spring,
wanted vegetables and herbs and flowers that served no practical purpose except making the place feel less like a work camp. Caleb thought it was a waste of water and effort when they could buy produce in town. They argued for 2 days before Lydia started digging anyway, and Caleb found himself helping despite his objections because watching her work alone felt worse than admitting he might be wrong. The garden grew. Not perfectly. Half the tomatoes died, rabbits ate the lettuce, and the flowers Lydia planted got trampled by a cow that broke through the fence. But it grew. And when Caleb came in from a brutal day of work to find fresh beans on the table and wildflowers in a jar, he understood what she'd been trying to tell him. Sometimes beauty mattered more than efficiency. Sometimes you needed to grow things just because they made you feel human. They fought about money, even though they had more of it than either had seen before. Lydia wanted to save aggressively, terrified of returning to the poverty she'd escaped. Caleb wanted to reinvest everything into the ranch, convinced that the only security was in building something sustainable. They compromised by doing both badly, saving less than Lydia wanted, investing less than Caleb needed, and somehow it worked well enough. They fought about space. The cabin was small, and they were two people used to solitude learning to exist in constant proximity. Some mornings, Caleb woke up feeling suffocated by another person's breathing, another person's needs, the endless negotiation of shared space. He'd go outside before dawn just to remember what silence felt like. Lydia did the same some evenings, riding into town for supplies they didn't actually need just to have an hour alone with her thoughts. "Do you regret it?" Lydia asked one night in July, after a particularly bad fight about something neither could remember the next day. "Marrying me?" They were lying in bed, not touching, both staring at the ceiling where the new roof Caleb had built didn't leak anymore. The question hung heavy in the dark. "No," Caleb said, and meant it. "I regret not knowing how to do this better, but I don't regret you. Even when I'm being difficult? Especially then. You being difficult means you're not pretending to be someone you're not. I can work with difficult. I can't work with fake." She rolled toward him, finding his hand in the darkness. "I'm sorry I threw the bowl at you. I'm sorry I said your garden was a waste of time. It is a waste of time. But it's my waste of time, and it makes me happy. Then it's not a waste." They learned each other slowly, in increments measured by seasons and small revelations. Caleb learned that Lydia was mean before coffee, brilliant with numbers, terrified of thunder because of something that happened in Nebraska she wouldn't talk about. Lydia learned that Caleb had nightmares about the war, hated being touched when he first woke up, and could fix almost anything mechanical but couldn't cook to save his life. They learned to fight better, not less, but better. Learned the difference between disagreement and disrespect, between honesty and cruelty. Learned when to push and when to give space, when to compromise and when to stand firm. By August, the ranch had expanded. They'd bought 20 more head of cattle, hired a seasonal worker named Tom who was slow-witted but strong and reliable, and started negotiations with the Hendersons about purchasing the bordering property. The money from the insurance was being used exactly as Lydia had planned, carefully, strategically, building security one purchase at a time. The town's attitude toward them had shifted. Not completely. There were still people who whispered about scandal and questioned Caleb's motives, but enough that Lydia could walk down the street without pointed stares, and Caleb could do business without being treated like a con artist. The wedding had helped. The money had helped more. People respected success, even when they'd predicted failure. But it was Victor's arrest that really changed things. The news came in September via telegram delivered by a breathless writer from Helena. Victor Harper had been charged with fraud, embezzlement, and breach of fiduciary duty in connection with at least 7 estates he'd been managing. The prosecution was using Lydia's case as their primary evidence. Her cooperation with the investigation had apparently provided the documentation needed to build a case against him. "They want me to testify," Lydia said, reading the telegram for the 3rd time. "At his trial in Boston. They'll pay for travel and lodging." Caleb was fixing the barn door, which had warped in the summer heat. He stopped, hammer in hand. "Do you want to go?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to see him face consequences. Part of me just wants to forget he exists." She folded the telegram carefully. "What do you think I should do?" "I think you should do whatever feels right to you. I'll support either choice. Even if it means going to Boston for a month, leaving you here alone."
The thought of a month without her made Caleb's chest tight, but he'd survived 6 years alone before she came along. He could survive a month now, even if he didn't want to. Even then, this is your decision, Lydia. I'm not going to control it. She studied him for a long moment. I want you to come with me. To Boston?
Why not? We have the money.
You've never been east of Ohio. It could be, I don't know, an adventure? A honeymoon we never took?
She was trying to sound casual, but he heard the uncertainty underneath. Or you could stay here and mind the ranch, and I'll go alone. That's fine, too. It wasn't fine. Caleb could hear in her voice that she wanted him there, needed him there, as she faced down the brother-in-law who'd stolen from her and tried to control her life. And despite his instinct to stay where he was comfortable, to tend his land and avoid the crowds and chaos of a city, he found himself nodding. All right, we'll go together. The relief on her face told him he'd made the right choice. They left in October when the ranch work had slowed and Tom could manage things with help from John Pritchard, who owed them a favor. The train journey east took 4 days, and every mile felt like moving backward in time toward a version of civilization Caleb had spent years escaping. Boston was overwhelming. Too many people, too much noise, buildings stacked so close together Caleb couldn't see the horizon. The air smelled wrong, coal smoke and garbage and humanity packed too tight. Lydia navigated it with the ease of someone who'd grown up there, leading him through streets that all looked the same to his rural eyes, pointing out landmarks he didn't care about. They stayed in a boarding house near the courthouse, a narrow building with thin walls where Caleb could hear neighboring residents arguing about things that seemed trivial compared to ranch concerns. Lydia seemed smaller here, more guarded, like the city was pressing down on her from all sides. I hate this place, she admitted the night before the trial. I know I grew up here, but I hate everything it represents. Poverty and pretension, and people judging you based on your father's failures instead of your own merit. Then why did you want to come back? Because I need Victor to see what I became without him. I need him to know that stealing from me didn't break me, it just made me stronger. She looked at Caleb. And I needed you here, so I'd remember who I am now, not who I was when I lived here. The trial was everything Caleb hated about civilization. Lawyers arguing technical points, judges speaking in language designed to confuse rather than clarify, spectators treating it like entertainment. Victor sat at the defense table looking older and smaller than Caleb remembered, his expensive suit unable to hide the defeat in his shoulders. When Lydia took the stand, her voice was steady as she walked the prosecutor through everything. The vague letters, the excessive fees, the way Victor had used her grief and confusion to maintain control. She didn't cry, didn't show anger or pain, just laid out the facts with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything. Victor's lawyer tried to paint her as ungrateful, suggested she'd been happy to let someone else handle the complicated business of estate management until money appeared and greed took over. Lydia didn't take the bait. I trusted him, she said simply. He was family, my husband's brother, and he used that trust to steal from me while making me feel like I should be grateful for his help. That's not greed on my part. That's betrayal on his. The trial lasted 3 days. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Victor was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 5 years in prison, plus restitution to all the estates he'd defrauded. When the verdict was read, he looked directly at Lydia, and Caleb saw something pass between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but maybe a final severing of whatever complicated family obligation had kept her tied to him. Afterward, standing on the courthouse steps in the gray Boston drizzle, Lydia turned to Caleb. Can we go home now? Thought you'd never ask. The train ride back felt different, lighter, like they'd shed weight neither had realized they were carrying. Lydia talked more, pointing out things she'd been too anxious to notice on the way east. Caleb found himself relaxing incrementally as they moved west, the cities giving way to towns, giving way to open land that looked like freedom. When they finally crossed into Montana territory, Lydia pressed her face to the window like a child. I never thought I'd say this, but I actually missed this place. The space, the silence, the way you can see weather coming from 20 miles away. She glanced at Caleb. Does that make me strange? Makes you a Montanan, whether you were born here or not. Tom had kept the ranch running smoothly in their absence. The cattle were healthy, the repairs Caleb had worried about were complete,
And there was even a new calf born while they were gone. Coming home felt like exhaling after holding his breath for a month. That winter was brutal. Blizzards rolled through with regularity, temperatures dropped low enough to kill exposed livestock, and Caleb spent more nights in the barn than in bed making sure the animals survived. But they had food stored, money in reserve, and each other to share the burden. What would have been a disaster alone was merely difficult together. Lydia discovered she was pregnant in February. She told him over breakfast on a morning when snow was falling so thick they couldn't see the barn from the house. She just said it straight out, no build-up or ceremony. "I'm pregnant, due sometime in August, I think." Caleb's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. "You're sure?" "I've been pregnant before, didn't carry to term, miscarried in Nebraska during the worst of it, but I know what it feels like." She watched his face carefully. "Are you happy about it?" He wanted to say yes immediately, wanted to give her the reaction she deserved, but honesty had become their foundation, and he couldn't build on lies now. "I'm terrified." "Good. Me too. What if I'm a terrible father? What if I can't protect them? What if you're exactly the father this child needs? What if you love them the way you've learned to love me? Imperfectly, but completely?" She reached across the table, took his hand. "We're going to mess this up, Caleb. We're going to make mistakes and have doubts and probably scar this kid in ways we can't predict. But we'll do it together, and that has to count for something." The baby, a girl they named Clara, after Lydia's mother, was born during a thunderstorm in August, squalling her anger at the world from her first breath. Caleb held her with shaking hands, this impossibly small person who was half him and half Lydia, and entirely her own mysterious self, and felt something inside him that had been broken since the war finally started to heal. Fatherhood was harder than ranching. Clara didn't sleep, cried for reasons he couldn't decipher, and required constant attention that left both him and Lydia exhausted to the point of delirium. But she also smiled, real smiles, not gas, and grabbed his finger with surprising strength and made sounds that weren't quite words but felt like communication anyway. "I have no idea what I'm doing," Caleb confessed one night, pacing the floor with the screaming Clara while Lydia tried to sleep. "Nobody does," Lydia mumbled into her pillow. "We're all just pretending and hoping the children don't notice." But they figured it out, the way they'd figured out everything else, imperfectly, through trial and error and occasional near disasters. Clara grew into a stubborn, curious toddler who thought the chickens were her personal friends and tried to ride the barn cat like a horse. She looked like Lydia, but had Caleb's stubborn streak, a combination that promised future challenges. 2 years after Clara came Thomas, named for the storekeeper who'd given Lydia the key that started everything. Thomas was easier, slept better, cried less, seemed content to observe the world rather than conquer it. Then came Margaret, who arrived early and small but fierce, making up for her size with lung capacity that could wake the dead. The cabin expanded with them. Caleb built additions whenever Lydia got pregnant, a bedroom for the children, a real kitchen with a proper stove, a covered porch where they could sit on summer evenings and watch the sun set over land they'd made their own. It wasn't fancy. The floors were still rough wood, the furniture mostly handmade, the decorations sparse. But it was full of noise and life and the chaos that came with children who didn't understand the concept of quiet. The ranch grew too. They bought the Henderson property, expanding their grazing land substantially, hired more help as the work increased, started breeding their own cattle rather than buying stock, developing a line that did well in Montana's harsh climate. Caleb's reputation shifted from hermit to successful rancher, and people who'd once avoided him now asked his advice on cattle and land management. Lydia never went back to teaching formally, but she taught anyway. Her own children first, then neighbor children whose parents couldn't read or whose schoolhouse was too far away. The kitchen table became a classroom some afternoons, filled with children of various ages learning mathematics and literature from a woman who refused to let frontier life be an excuse for ignorance. "You're still doing it," Caleb observed one afternoon, watching her explain long division to the Pritchard twins while Thomas tried to eat his slate and Clara practiced her letters. "Doing what?" "Teaching, being exactly who you are, just in a different context." She smiled. "Some things don't change just because circumstances do. I'm a teacher. That's who I am. The school board didn't get to take that away from me. Victor Harper died in prison during his 3rd year.
Pneumonia, according to the brief notice that appeared in the Boston papers. Lydia read it without expression, then folded the paper and used it to start the fire. She never mentioned him again. The money from the insurance ran out eventually, or rather got absorbed into the ranch and the house and the children and the 1,000 expenses that came with building a life. But by then it didn't matter. They'd used it to create something sustainable, something that generated its own security. The ranch was profitable. The children were healthy. The debts were paid. Some nights, when the children were finally asleep and the house was quiet, except for the usual creaks and settling, Caleb and Lydia would sit on the porch and look out at what they'd built together. Not just the physical structures, the barn, the fences, the expanded house, but the intangible things, the family, the partnership, the life neither had believed they deserved. "Do you remember that first night?" Lydia asked one evening in late summer, maybe 5 years after they'd married. "When you came home and found me in your kitchen? I remember thinking you were crazy. I was crazy. Am crazy. Coming out here alone, breaking into a stranger's house, cooking dinner like I had any right to be there." She leaned against him, comfortable in a way that had taken years to develop. "But I was also desperate. Desperate to find something real in a life that felt like I was just going through motions. And somehow I found you. I wasn't looking for you." "I know. That's what made it work. We weren't trying to fill voids in each other's lives. We were just two people who happened to collide at the right moment." She paused. "Or the wrong moment, depending on how you look at it." Caleb thought about that, about timing and chance and the series of small decisions that had led to this moment. Thomas Greer giving her the key, Lydia deciding to use it, Caleb not shooting her on sight, the storm that trapped them together, the inheritance that changed everything, Victor's fraud that was discovered just in time. Any one of those things going differently, and they wouldn't be here now. "I think it was the right moment," he said finally, even when it felt like the wrong one. Clara appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Papa, there's a mouse in the bedroom." "There's always a mouse in the bedroom. It's Montana. Mice exist." "But this one's big." Caleb sighed, stood up. "I'll check." Probably just Thomas making shadows with his hands again. He went inside, leaving Lydia on the porch with her thoughts. The house was dim, lit only by a single lamp in the kitchen, but he navigated it easily, knew every board, every corner, every squeak in the floor. This was his house now, truly his in a way the cabin never had been when he lived there alone. Because a house wasn't just walls and roof. It was the people inside it, the memories made there, the life it contained. There was no mouse. Thomas had indeed been making shadow puppets that frightened his sister. Caleb sorted it out, got everyone back to bed, returned to the porch to find Lydia right where he'd left her. "False alarm?" "Always is with those two. Claire's convinced every shadow is a monster, and Thomas encourages her because he thinks it's funny. He gets that from you. He gets everything annoying from me. Everything good is obviously from you." She laughed quietly. "That's not how genetics work." "I'm aware, but it makes me feel better about my contribution to their personalities." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds, crickets, distant coyotes, the wind moving through grass that hadn't been there when Caleb first claimed this land. Everything had changed. He'd changed. From a man who thought isolation was survival to someone who understood that real survival required connection, required letting people in, even when it was terrifying. "I love you," he said, because he'd gotten better at saying it over the years, and it still felt important to say out loud. "I know. You tell me every day." "Because every day I wake up and think I might be dreaming, that I might open my eyes and find myself back in that empty cabin, alone, with nothing but ghosts and regrets for company." Lydia turned to look at him, her face serious in the lamplight spilling from inside. "You're not dreaming. This is real. We're real. The children are real, frustratingly, exhaustingly real. The ranch is real. Everything we built together is real. I know, but sometimes I need the reminder. Then I'll keep reminding you." She kissed him softly. "That's what marriage is, right? Constant reminders that you're not alone, even when your brain tries to convince you otherwise." Years passed, measured in children growing and seasons changing, and the gradual accumulation of small victories and minor disasters that made up a life. Clara grew tall and stubborn, determined to be the first girl rancher in Montana Territory.
Thomas developed his father's quiet competence and his mother's love of books, a combination that made him equally comfortable with cattle or poetry. Margaret remained small and fierce, certain that volume compensated for size in all situations.
More children came. Another boy, then twin girls who arrived during a blizzard and seemed determined to cause chaos from birth. The house expanded again. The ranch grew. Caleb's hair went gray at the temples. Lydia's hands developed calluses that never quite healed, marks of work and life lived fully. The town changed too. The school board that had forced Lydia out eventually dissolved in scandal, financial irregularities that made Victor's fraud look minor by comparison. A new board formed, more progressive, and they asked Lydia to come back. She declined politely, said her teaching happened at home now, and she was content with that. People who'd once gossiped about their scandalous marriage now pointed to them as an example of what frontier marriage should be: partnership, hard work, commitment that survived difficulties. Caleb found this ironic, given how close they'd come to disaster multiple times. But he didn't correct the narrative. Let people believe what they wanted. He knew the truth. Their marriage worked not because it was easy or perfect, but because they'd both been willing to fight for it even when fighting seemed pointless. Sometimes late at night when insomnia struck and he couldn't sleep, Caleb would walk through his house and count blessings he'd never expected to have. 5 children breathing softly in their beds. A wife who'd chosen him over easier options. A ranch that supported them all. Walls that didn't leak. Food in the pantry. Animals in the barn. All the small securities that added up to a life worth living. He'd think about the man he'd been before Lydia. Angry, isolated, convinced he didn't deserve happiness or connection or any of the things that made life bearable. That man felt like a stranger now, someone he'd been in another lifetime. The war had tried to kill him, and when it failed, he'd tried to finish the job himself through isolation and neglect. It had taken a woman breaking into his house and cooking him dinner to interrupt that slow suicide. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 6 years building walls to keep people out, and it took someone ignoring those walls completely to show him they were a prison rather than protection. On their 10th anniversary, Caleb took Lydia back to town, just the two of them, leaving the children with the Pritchards, and they had dinner at the boarding house where they'd stayed before the wedding. It wasn't fancy. The food was mediocre and the room was loud with other diners' conversations. But it was theirs, a moment carved out of the chaos to remember who they'd been and appreciate who they'd become. 10 years, Lydia said, raising her glass of wine that probably cost too much. We've survived 10 years of each other. Survived isn't the word I'd use. What word would you use? Caleb thought about it. Thrived, maybe. We've thrived despite everything suggesting we shouldn't. I'll drink to that. She clinked her glass against his. Here's to 10 more years of thriving despite ourselves. They drank, and Caleb felt the weight of everything they'd built together. Not just the physical structures, but the intangible architecture of a marriage that had somehow survived isolation and money and childbirth and all the small daily frictions that broke weaker bonds. They'd done it by being honest, even when honesty hurt, by fighting when fighting mattered, by choosing each other repeatedly, every day, even on days when choosing seemed hard. Later, walking back through town in the dark, Lydia slipped her hand into his. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't come that night? If I decided it was too crazy, too forward, too much? Every day, Caleb admitted. I'd probably still be alone in that cabin, eating beans from a can and pretending I was fine. Would you have been fine eventually? No. I'd have been exactly what I was, surviving but not living, getting older and harder and more isolated until I died alone and nobody noticed for weeks. He squeezed her hand. You saved me from that. From myself, really. You saved me too, from a life of being managed and controlled and never quite being allowed to be myself. She looked up at the stars, bright in the Montana darkness. We saved each other. That's not nothing. That's everything. They walked home in comfortable silence, and Caleb thought about how lucky he'd been. Not in the winning lottery sense, but in the sense of being in the right place at the right time to be saved by someone brave enough to break into a stranger's house because she thought he needed saving. The truth was, he had needed saving. Just like Lydia had needed saving from Victor's control and the town's judgment and her own belief that she had to accept whatever life handed her. They'd saved each other by refusing to accept the stories other people told about what their lives should look like. Years continued their march. Children grew into adults with their own dreams and complications. Clara left to study animal husbandry at a college in California, determined to bring modern ranching techniques back to Montana. Thomas stayed to help run the ranch, content with the life his parents had built. Margaret became a teacher like her mother, but in Denver, where the pay was better and the school board less likely to fire her for being female. The twins went in completely different directions, one to nursing, one to running a saloon that scandalized everyone but made excellent money. The youngest boy, Quiet Daniel, became a carpenter and built houses throughout the territory that were known for their quality and craftsmanship. Caleb and Lydia grew old together, their faces weathering like the land around them, their bodies slowing but their minds staying sharp. They sat on the porch most evenings now, watching sunsets over property they'd spent decades building into something sustainable. The ranch would outlast them. Thomas and his wife were running it now, with plans to expand further south. "We did all right," Lydia said one evening when they were both past 60 and Montana Territory had finally become Montana State. "Given where we started, better than all right." Caleb's hands shook more now, arthritis claiming what hard work had spared. But they still found Lydia's, still held on. "We built something real, something that lasted. 5 children who turned into decent adults despite our mistakes. A ranch that supports 3 families now. A marriage that shouldn't have worked but did." She counted on her fingers. "I'd say we exceeded expectations." Whose expectations? Everyone's. Victor's, the town's, our own, probably. She leaned her head on his shoulder, a gesture that had become habitual over decades. "I remember when I first came here, I thought I'd cook you one meal and leave. Thought I was just being kind to a lonely rancher who needed someone to check on him. I had no idea it would turn into this." "This being? Everything. You, us, all of it." She gestured to encompass the house, the land, the life they'd built. "I was looking for something to make me feel less alone, and I found a whole life instead." Caleb thought about that first night. How angry he'd been. How violated, how certain this woman was crazy or dangerous or both. How wrong he'd been about everything. The best thing that ever happened to him had started with someone ignoring his boundaries and forcing him to remember he was human. "I'm glad you broke into my house," he said. Lydia laughed, the same real laugh she'd had at 30. "Best decision I ever made, even if it was completely inappropriate and probably illegal." "Definitely illegal. You used a stolen key." "Borrowed. I borrowed a key with permission. From someone who didn't own my house." "Details." She squeezed his hand. "The important thing is I did it. I was brave or stupid or desperate enough to do it, and it changed everything." They sat there as darkness fell. 2 people who'd been strangers once upon a time, now so intertwined that imagining life without the other was impossible. The house behind them was full of memories, children's laughter, arguments resolved and unresolved, meals shared, illnesses survived, joys celebrated. The land around them held decades of work and sweat and small victories against nature's indifference. This was what they'd built from nothing. Not just a ranch or a house or a family, but a life that mattered. A life that proved isolation wasn't safety and connection wasn't weakness. A life that demonstrated what happened when 2 broken people decided to be broken together instead of alone. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of approaching rain. Inside, they could hear Thomas and his wife getting their own children ready for bed. The next generation beginning their own journey through the chaos of family life. Soon there would be grandchildren sleeping in the same rooms where Caleb and Lydia's children had slept, making the same noise, causing the same trouble. "We should go in," Lydia said. "It's getting cold." But neither of them moved. They sat there a little longer, holding hands in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the life they'd created, voices and footsteps, and the ordinary music of people existing together in the same space. Finally they stood together, their movements slower than they'd once been, but still synchronized after decades of practice. They walked inside, closing the door on the Montana night, and Caleb thought about how far they'd come from that November evening when he'd found smoke in his chimney and a stranger in his kitchen. That stranger had become his wife, the mother of his children, his partner in building something that would outlast them both. She'd saved him from a life of slow death by isolation, and he'd given her a space where she could be herself without apology or control. It wasn't a perfect life. They'd fought and struggled and made mistakes that couldn't be undone. But it was theirs, built together, defended together, lived fully together. And in the end, that was what mattered most. Not the money, or the land, or the social approval they'd eventually earned, but the simple fact that they'd chosen each other and kept choosing each other every day for decades. In the warmth of their house, surrounded by family and the evidence of a life well lived, Caleb Morgan realized he'd finally found what he'd been running from after the war: peace. Not the peace of silence and isolation, but the peace that came from connection, from being known completely and loved anyway, from building something that would outlast your own mortality. He'd come home to an empty house expecting nothing but silence. Instead, he'd found everything: love, family, purpose, and a life worth the struggle it took to build. All because a school teacher had been brave enough to walk uninvited into a stranger's loneliness and refused to leave until she'd reminded him what it meant to be alive. That was the real story, Caleb thought. Not the money or the scandal or the triumph over Victor's control. Just two people who'd been alone too long, finding each other at exactly the right moment, then doing the hard work of staying found. Everything else, the children, the ranch, the decades of partnership, was just the natural result of that first improbable choice to trust that connection was worth the risk. And it had been. Every moment of difficulty, every argument, every challenge, all of it had been worth it for this. Growing old with someone who understood him completely, in a house full of life they'd created together, on land they'd made their own through decades of stubborn persistence. Caleb looked at Lydia across the dinner table where they'd shared thousands of meals, and she looked back with eyes that had seen him at his worst and his best, and every variation in between. They didn't need words anymore for the important things. After this long, the important things were understood. Outside, Montana stretched endlessly under stars that had witnessed everything: the isolation, the meeting, the struggle, the triumph, the slow accumulation of days into years into a life. Inside, two people who'd saved each other sat together in the warmth they'd built, grateful for the chance collision that had turned strangers into partners, into something deeper than either word could capture. This was what they'd built from nothing. Not a perfect life, but a real one. Not an easy partnership, but an honest one. Not a story that would make sense to everyone, but one that made sense to them. And that was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.